Mike, let me ask you about a couple of things that now seem like legitimately open questions. Obviously, the president settled so much of what has been uncertain in Democratic politics and in American politics with this dramatic decision today. But there are open questions now, one more technocratic and one quite substantive in terms of the politics of it. The technocratic question is if, as you put it, President Biden is hoping that the party will unite now behind the candidate he has endorsed, behind his Vice President Kamala Harris, is there clarity about what needs to happen technically in terms of the delegates, in terms of ballot access, in terms of fundraising? We've seen a filing with the FEC already, noting that that Kamala Harris is now at the top of the ticket for what previously had been their joint ticket. Is there clarity within the White House as to how technically this is going to happen? And the other question, very much an open question, is who Kamala Harris will choose as her running mate. Is that discussion open and engaged at the White House at this point?
Well, I'll start with that first question because this is so interesting to me, Rachel, where inadvertently some Republicans in the state of Ohio who were trying to, in the view of the Biden team and the Democratic National Committee, play games with election access by potentially depriving Biden from being put on the ballot in the state of Ohio because the convention for the DNC was after Ohio's filing deadline. That kicked into gear a process by which we would have this virtual nomination decided well in advance of the Ohio deadline to end that uncertainty. And as I understand it, the conversations in the last few days have also focused on what this process would look like to move forward with that plan, to have a virtual nomination, choose the nominee. The biggest uncertainty, though, during these conversations was would any other Democrat raise their hand and choose to run if President Biden were to step aside, but even if he were to stay in this race. And that is where we still have some uncertainty about what there might be in terms of a mini primary, what Vice President Harris might have to do to show if there are other candidates in this race, how she can put herself to the top of the line in the view of those delegates to the convention to earn their support. And that's why there was a lot made of Barack Obama, former president's statement today, where he was effusive in praising his former running mate for making this very difficult decision. But absent from that statement was any discussion of supporting Vice President Harris in this process. That was very deliberate, as I'm told from sources familiar with his thinking, because just as in 2020, when he was supportive in certain ways but not explicitly endorsing Joe Biden as a candidate in 2020, he wanted to be in position once the nomination was decided to rally the rest of the party fully behind the nominee, whomever that ended up being. He wants to ensure that he can do just that right now. So the DNC is still working through this. The chairman of the DNC putting out a statement saying that they will have more to say in the coming days about that process. But I think the biggest question that will dictate the process moving forward is, will anybody raise their hand to do that? Now, as it relates to the running mate decision, this is something I've been hearing about for weeks already, in fact. One of the first names that was raised to me is somebody who we just received a statement from, was the governor of North Carolina, Roy Cooper, who is endorsing Vice President Harris to be the Democratic nominee. He is somebody who has been mentioned to me for several reasons. One, he is a sitting and finishing his second term as the governor of North Carolina, an important battleground state. He is somebody who served for 16 years as the Attorney General of North Carolina, including 6 years when he served at the same time as the former California Attorney General, Kamala Harris. They have a relationship. He was just with her, in fact, as she campaigned there 2 days ago. That is one that is at the top of the list for many I've been speaking to. Another name that has been mentioned is Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, somebody who is new to the Senate, somebody who's a veteran, and somebody who could bring a lot of dynamism potentially to this ticket as well. When I've been speaking to people close to Vice President Harris over the course of the last week, they have been erring on the side of total loyalty to President Biden. They did not, as I asked one official, are you making preparations to have to step in here, including vetting a potential running mate? And they said they didn't want any daylight to be seen between her continued support for President Biden staying in this race and signals that might be perceived as disloyalty by doing just those things. So now there have been some people close to her who, on her behalf, were undergoing a process of potentially putting a campaign or the makings of some staff to support her together. But now she will be fully now engaged in the conversation moving forward about who a running mate would be. There's going to be certainly a lot more names than the two that I just mentioned that are brought about to this conversation. There are plenty of governors and senators who would like to be part of that conversation, especially. But this is now a moment when Vice President Harris is deferring to President Biden, wants to let him have his moment before she begins making her own case for her candidacy moving forward.
NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli near President Biden's home in Rehoboth Beach, Delaware. Historic day. It's good to have you with us, Mike. Let us know if you get anything new that we need to get on the air during the special coverage. I appreciate it. Let me underscore what Mike just said there about that new news from Governor Roy Cooper of North Carolina. He is one of the people who has frequently been described as a potential running mate for Kamala Harris at the top of the ticket for the Democrats. He has now explicitly endorsed Kamala Harris's candidacy for president. Another governor in an important state, Pennsylvania, Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, out earlier this evening with a ringing endorsement of Kamala Harris for president. So we're starting to see the kind of consolidation in the Democratic Party that I think you would expect after this unequivocal endorsement from President Biden, including from men who may be candidates, maybe on the short list as a potential vice presidential running mate.